Thanks, JC, and thank you everybody for coming to our first healthcare entrepreneur meetup. And so as part of Atlanta Ventures, we host meetups in the morning to help connect entrepreneurs together. And over the past year, one of the things we found is there's a lot of passion and excitement for healthcare in Atlanta. And so there are a lot of great ingredients between entrepreneurs starting companies, all the great health systems here, all the resources at Georgia Tech, Emory, and how do we help better connect those resources, especially from the ground up, from the entrepreneur level? And so that was sort of the idea behind this, because we truly believe Atlanta has all the ingredients to make it the premier place to start a health IT business. And so the more we can do to help foster and connect that, that's our goal here. So again, I'm AT. We got Mike and David here from Clockwise.MD, and we'll go through their stories in a little bit. But really what we wanted to do today is just start with a little bit of their background, how they got into healthcare and entrepreneurship, go through their stories at two different companies, Dialogue Medical and then Clockwise.MD that they were involved with, and then close with just some general thoughts around healthcare and entrepreneurship, how it's different than starting another business, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities there. So great, so I'll start just to get us going. Maybe Mike, I'll start with you first. How did you get into healthcare?
Well, I was an engineer and was involved straight out of undergrad in the machine tool industry. And this was back in the late '80s, I guess. And at that time, the same sort of thing was happening in the American machine tool industry that happened in the automobile industry probably 10, 15 years earlier, and that was that the American machine tool companies were losing significant market share to foreign competition, and it was a really very difficult industry to be involved with. And so I decided that I wanted to choose an industry that I thought would have the opportunity for continued dynamic growth, and was convinced that healthcare was probably the right industry to get involved in. And so after grad school, I narrowed my search pretty specifically to healthcare companies, and then ended up working for a medical device company called CR Bard.
Great, and then how did you then decide to make that transition from in healthcare with an established company to more of the entrepreneurial route?
Well, that was kind of a non-traditional path. Basically, I had an opportunity that was presented to me that was fairly unique. When I was at CR Bard, I had the opportunity to commercialize a software technology that had been developed by a couple of physicians. You'd call it what they had, basically an MVP at the time, even though that whole lexicon didn't exist back in the, how long ago was that?
A while.
Date yourself. Yeah, early 90s, I guess. There was no customer development or customer discovery, and so. But so anyway, at Bard, we were able to commercialize this technology largely as a value add for the physicians that we sold our medical devices to, and it became enormously popular. But Bard, not being a software company, had no idea what to do with it, and so we had the opportunity to obtain the rights to the program and spin it off, basically. So, I was naive enough at the time to think that there'd be no risks and that everything would be smooth sailing, and so that naivete allowed me to kind of jump into it, I guess.
Very, very cool. And now, David, you've done both healthcare and non-healthcare. Tell me sort of what's appealing to you when you've done your healthcare stints.
Well, I started healthcare because I met Mike after the dot-com bust, so I feel like I owe Mike my first job after all that dot-com stuff sort of fell apart. So it felt stable, it felt like something had a longer sales cycle, but also a longer churn cycle. So it's a lot easier to get into from the aspect of a solid business. Healthcare moves slow, but they also move slow to get rid of services as well as adopt them. So that felt much more comfortable than trying to compete with Slack or something like that, where you're just every month is a new potential for a new set of features, or losing a customer due to one feature you just never implemented. So for me, Between the two healthcare companies, I had another startup in the middle that was out of New York, and it was really hard to find market fit.
Yeah, challenging one for many companies, right? That product market fit. So maybe let's move into that first story, with Dialogue Medical, and maybe give us, just for the audience, background of what the company was, what they did, and then how you got the idea to really start going full time on that.
Sure. So Dialogue Medical had a product called iMed Consent, and it automated the informed consent process. So when healthcare providers, primarily physicians, were engaging in the shared decision-making process with patients, about whether to do a procedure or a diagnostic procedure, a surgical procedure, they would use our software to help educate and inform the patient, about the procedure, about the risks, the benefits, the alternatives, et cetera. And then once a decision was made, our software would document that decision with electronic signatures and capture and store the document in an electronic medical record system, for the hospital. And we were fortunate enough to win a large contract with the VA kind of early on, and so that kind of set the pace for the company.
And so with that contract, tell us more. How did you get into that one? Obviously, it's a big challenge is getting those first ones, and in healthcare, right? Having a big one's a good name for you. How did that happen?
Well, I'll go back to that earlier comment about the fact that this whole notion of customer discovery and customer development didn't exist back then, so we had to kind of crawl around blindly and turn over rocks and see what was underneath without really kind of having a paradigm to follow. But in that particular circumstance, our VP of sales was good friends with his next door neighbor, who was the chief of urology at the Atlanta VA. And so he introduced the idea to him, and a guy named Moody Issa, and he loved the idea and brought it to the Atlanta VA leadership. They loved the idea. They started using the product. We were then able to start selling to individual VA facilities across the country. I think we had about 15 or so.
Yeah, we're getting up to 20s.
Yeah, we had about 15, and tiny little company with 5-6 people or something, and we're finally bringing in some meaningful revenue. And the VA, the central office, came to us and said, "We love your product. We want to consider it for a national rollout. But while we're thinking about it, you can't sell to any more VAs." And so our revenue source just dried up completely, and we had to tread water for a year and a half, I think. Was that about right? Yeah, we had to tread water for a year and a half. And this is also, in addition to customer discovery and customer development not really being a thing back then, the other thing was that venture capital was still a very nascent industry back then, and it was very, very difficult to get funded. And even with a pending contract with an organization like the VA, nobody was really interested in giving us any money. So I had to double mortgage my house and sign on our line of credit. And at the time I had a 1-year-old and my wife was pregnant and not working. So it was an interesting time, to say the least. But it helps to be young and really naive and just have no idea what the risks actually are. It kind of gets you through some of that uncertainty, I think.
Interesting. So let me ask a couple more things there, because an interesting one. Start with the VA part of that, right? Again, you mentioned it, right? The long sales cycles in healthcare. This was a relationship wanting to get going. What was that timeline like from when you first started discussions to first even getting in for pilots at the first locations to then moving on to where you're at there with your multiple locations?
Well, it was at a time when the VA initially could be a little more entrepreneurial. The individual facilities, they had actually developed at the time the best medical record, which was, what was it called? CPR? Vista, yeah, it was called Vista. Oh, it's so funny, David, when we had to write our integration, they were using Mumps, which is the same database that Epic uses, and David basically had to reverse engineer the work that had been done, with Vista, and in so doing, he became like a national expert that all the VA people started to come to him on the news groups for advice on how to work. Anyway, I digress. So we started working with the Atlanta VA, and the thought leaders at Atlanta VA were very well connected. The VA had these things called VISMs, which were regional networks, and word spreads very, very quickly, just like it does, in the private sector. In a metro area, when you have a product, placement at, say, Piedmont, and it's very successful, the folks from Emory are going to learn about it pretty quickly, and things spread. And we were the beneficiaries of that with Clockwise as well, in several metro areas too. So I would say it spread largely word of mouth. We had a very traditional sales process. We'd go get on airplanes and talk to facilities about adopting it, and they had some local budgets. But now that's all changed. The VA doesn't work that way anymore. So anybody who wants to do government contracting, it's not that easy any longer. But then once the decision-making process for the central office started, that was I don't know. They just basically, it became a black box, and they said, we're thinking about it, we're thinking about it. And then all of a sudden, a year and a half later, they said, okay, we've thought about it, we're ready to move forward.
Well, they also had hurdles, like every once in a while you find out, oh, you've got to go through the certification process, so you need to build a box, ship it down to this place, and then it's got to go through penetration testing and security audits and blah, 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 and then you get through that, and then there's more documentation you forgot to fill out regarding something else, and then a GSA contract maybe. So there was a lot of just, okay, are we on step 1 of, or 6 of 400 or 6 of 800? And it was just figuring out where we were in the process.
Plus we had a couple of interesting government shutdown stories too. So.
Always comes back, right? So tell me then more about with the VA and the process, right? Hey, you're in with them, things seem to be going well, but it's on hold. What do? You mentioned mortgaging the house. How did you think about looking at other avenues to grow as well? Or you sort of said, we're just going to put all our eggs in this basket and see what happens?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because we had a real decision to make at the time, because, we had, I think that in order to sell our product to the VA, if I remember correctly, we had to piggyback on someone else's VA contract, basically, because we weren't certified, or I don't know. And, all these entities that were selling services to the VA said, wow, now that you're in, just build another product for the VA, and you become a government contractor, and that becomes your career, and we had never intended that and had never considered that, but we talked about it a little bit, and we said, well, we don't want to be exclusively a government contractor, and so instead we turned our focus to the private sector and said we want to get this product in private sector hospitals as well.
And so as you made that transition there then, to say you want to get in the private sector as well, how did that change your focus on the product or the value proposition or the sales process? Anything change there as you started to look into those avenues as well?
Dialogue is a different product than Clockwise. So for Dialogue, you have to imagine back when we first started, it was delivered on CD-ROM. So you were installing it on the computer. So when we talked about Issa installing it on one of his computers, that literally he popped a CD in and installed it on his computer. So in the day of Clockwise, everything is built on AWS, always cloud-based, cloud first. So it's a little bit of a different avenue. Even in hospital systems now, you get a little bit more freedom with the individual hospital, but once the individual hospital sort of lets news out that they've got a solution, then it starts hitting the whole system, and the whole system will put you through a review, IT review, they want to make sure they got the best discount because they've got more than one hospital, so forth and so on. So if you can get in on one doctor in one location, and you sort of grassroots from the ground up, it's a lot easier. But once you start in from the top and you're going down through a health system, I mean, that's when you hit all their processes.
Yeah, no, good point. I want to come back to that a little bit, sort of those nuances there, but sort of to wrap up dialogue, take us through the next step. That if now you've got VA, you're starting to get some private penetration there. Yeah. What's next? How do you think about growing the team, raising money? What happened next?
Well, I guess the biggest context for this is that this is like 99, 2000 basically, right? And the whole .com craziness is starting to kind of pick up steam. And we were able to go out and secure a number of marquee accounts that kind of helped us to grow in the private sector.
We were at
Yeah.
Believe it or not,
I'm reversing my timelines here. I'm having a hard time remembering.
We put ads in the software that was installed on CD.
Yeah. I apologize. Yeah, but that's a different story. The whole selling the company twice, that was a completely different story. Our go-to-market strategy was, interestingly, not significantly different from what you'd see today. I would say the biggest difference was that we had an outbound strategy, but there was no such thing as inbound. I mean, nobody was writing blogs and trying to position themselves as thought leaders and trying to pull in traffic that way. But we did a fair amount of email-based marketing, and we weren't as good at it as we are today. And as I mentioned, the body of knowledge didn't really exist, but that's largely what we did. And back then, you still had to get on an airplane to go, sign a deal. I think we were able to get one of our hospitals to sign a deal completely remotely, but every other one we had to go visit.
And a ton of conferences.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That was probably one of our biggest lead gen sources, was going to all the different surgical conferences, the American Urological Association, and AAOS, and all the various and sundry different surgical.
So on that point, how important is that in healthcare specifically? Every industry has their conferences, but healthcare with the bigger ones and the HIMSS and the JP Morgan and the AHIPs and all the specific ones, how important are those to selling in healthcare?
Well, I think it's really important as a general rule. There are so many different parts of healthcare, and for most of them, I think that those trade shows are very, very important lead gen sources, maybe even the most important lead gen sources. But there are exceptions to the rule. I think that a fair amount of the patient experience, companies who don't need to convince a physician or a surgeon of the value of their product, they're not going to be going to the same sorts of trade shows that we went to. And ironically, the biggest trade show in the entire industry, HIMSS, has almost become a non-promotional event. I mean, there are a number of companies that just decide not to go there anymore because it's so big that they can't attract any attention, particularly with a 10x10 booth. I mean, there's just nothing to do there any longer. And, if you're a company of a certain stage, the place to be is the JP Morgan conference, which is largely a financial conference. You've got investors that are looking for the next big thing, basically. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's fine. So then we'll get to the Clockwise story here. I mean, it's just to wrap up Dialogue Medical. You mentioned alluding to selling it twice. Tell us that story and what you learned from that.
All right, I'll try to do it in a nutshell. So it was, like I said before, 99, 2000, .com craziness is starting to happen. And, for those of you who are too young to know, the speculative values of .com companies was absolutely insane because people thought that anyone who had the attention of users were worth tons and tons of money regardless of whether there was any revenue or not. So, we were a tiny company at that point. We had, I think, maybe 6-7 employees, but we had a large penetration in healthcare. And so a company called Medscape, which is still around today as part of WebMD, got interested in us. They acquired us, and at that time, the currency of the day was stock. I mean, you had all these companies that had billion-dollar valuations and didn't have two nickels to rub together. So I mean, it was all stock-based transactions, and so we allowed ourselves to be acquired. It took an entire year to close the deal. We operated as a wholly owned subsidiary for that year. We finally closed the deal almost in direct conjunction with when everything fell off a cliff from the dot-com perspective. And a month later, we got a call from their attorneys. Oh, by the way, by this time, Medscape had merged with a company called Medicalogic, which later became the EMR for GE Medical. And the company had a market cap in excess of $1 billion and revenue that was almost unmeasurably low. And after the dot-com crash, we got a call from the attorneys who said, we're going to give you back the assets to your company, and you can keep all the stock that we gave you if you promise not to sue us, because it kind of looked like there was some sort of an inducement to sell. So we had our company back. We had these shares of Medscape Medicalogic that we had to hold for a year. So we got to watch them go from like $80 a share all the way down to I think $3 a share when we finally got to sell it. But we had our company back, and so we started over, and we pivoted, we changed our focus, and we were able to go get the VA and do it all again, and not on a stock deal the next time.
So Mike gets to claim he's got 3 exits, but with only 2 companies.
Very good, very good. Well, cool. So let's maybe then transition to the Clockwise now. So sort of, sold dialogue. Take us through the thought process of how you then came up with the idea for Clockwise and what made you go pursue that.
Well, the idea for Clockwise, I have to kind of credit to a buddy of mine, cardiologist Walter Mashman, who has been sort of a frustrated entrepreneur for most of his life. And we were having lunch, and he said that he had this idea, at a table, you could have this little screen that would let you know, where your food was at and how long it was going to be before your food would show up. And I said, well, that's a terrible idea, for a restaurant, but it might work in healthcare. And so it's not a terrible idea for a restaurant, but it's just hard to. That's a tough thing to sell into. But we started. I was still actually employed at Standard Register, the company that bought Dialogue Medical the second time, and so we started kind of working nights and weekends on the project, and and at that time, customer discovery did exist, and I was a huge fan of it. And so, we just went through the whole playbook and talked to as many people as we possibly could, and put a fair amount of effort in. I recruited a couple of engineers at one of those startup weekend events, which was fantastic. And so they were working with me nights and weekends for about 3 or 4 months to put together an MVP. We had a beta user, and then we went to a trade show. It was the what was it called? The urgent care trade show.
UCAOA.
Yeah, UCAOA. And at that trade show, we were able to sign up 7 customers, including 2 big marquee customers, Wake Forest Health, and I can't remember who the other one was. And so, and we're still doing this nights and weekends, 3 people at the time. And so I came back to my wife and said, I think we're going to do it all again. And she was like, oh, you're kidding me. I can't believe it. So
She didn't say, yes, that's a great idea, go for it?
No, she didn't. But,
and so this was, Mike, this was 2012, when was it? What was this?
Early 2013.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so as of May, immediately after that trade show, I quit the other job. I came to the Tech Village. I think I was, you guys had started like 3 months earlier, I think, if I remember. It was before the whole rehab and everything. And I was just me at a desk upstairs. And then later on in the year, the two engineers joined us. I was fortunate enough to be able to fund the company, so we didn't have to, we didn't have to go out for any outside capital at that point. And that was the start of it.
So tell me more about the customer discovery process. That's one with lots of challenges for entrepreneurs, and also in healthcare, sometimes it's harder to even get in to have some of those conversations. What did you learn? Because you mentioned you did a much more thorough customer discovery process with Clockwise versus Dialogue. Tell us more about that.
Well, most of the customer discovery texts will beat the idea into you that when someone says no, or when you have a negative response, that's just as valuable as a positive response, because what you're supposed to be looking for is learning, not closing deals, and that's absolutely the case, because we tried this thing, we tested this idea in a lot of different segments, and by utilizing the customer discovery framework, we were able to figure out that urgent care was the segment that absolutely needed this technology, and that they were desperate to both attract and retain patients in a way that that other specialties were years away from. So it allowed us to focus specifically on the right segment, which was just growing like crazy.
You mentioned the focus on urgent care and going through the customer discovery process to find that. We see lots of startups that there's lots of shiny objects or different segments, and especially in healthcare where segments can be very different from each other. Yeah. What gave you the confidence that was the right segment, or that you would find product market fit in that segment?
Well, so the first thing I'll say is, if you haven't read the book called The Mom Test, read The Mom Test. That's the most helpful business book I've read in the past 10 years. And it completely outlines what we did wrong with the customer discovery process, which is that when, if you go in and you talk about your idea and people give you this validation, oh yeah, that's a great idea, that makes you feel so good, and you think that you're getting these buy signals, when in reality, unfortunately, that information is not only not helpful, it's frequently harmful. And so, what ultimately matters, are things that you can measure. The customer discovery process, you have to ask specific questions that have specific answers. You can't ask for opinion, because people are going to tell you what they think you want to hear. So we got specific answers. I think for us, we were so fortunate that the segment that we happened to stumble on was growing so rapidly that we tried to do normal customer discovery, and people were saying, yeah, that's fine, but I want to buy your product now, And so we said, okay, we'll sell you our product, and we just had so many strong buying signals that the decision was easy for us, I think. And from a technology perspective at the time, I was trying to convince him to join me again, but he wasn't quite ready yet, unfortunately. So he came on a little later.
So to that point, David, what made you come back to join Mike again with Clockwise?
Well, I was when I moved from New York on a failed startup back to Atlanta, I joined a larger company and felt at the time it was great to get a larger company set of experiences. And eventually got tired of the larger corporate experiences. And for me, it's around ownership, and whether you're a CTO or a CEO, or you're just another employee in the company, it's all around ownership. And the larger the company it gets, the less ownership you have over, kind of choosing your path, making things work. So yeah, it's really around, even when we had Clockwise and we started growing into 20s and 30s, it's around thinking about ownership and how everyone can feel like an owner, and ensure that if there's something blocking your way, it's not me, it's not this other fellow that was working on the team, it's you. You have the opportunity to take it by the horns and go with it. So yeah, in the company I was at, it was just getting more and more frustrating.
Yeah, so tell me more about that with Clockwise, as you came to Clockwise, and the importance of that ownership and the culture that's set by the leadership team. What was that culture like at Clockwise? What did you guys try and create there?
We took several, there's a lot of culture books. I mean, right now you can pull up a culture book for any company, whether it's Spotify or Netflix, and look at a few of those pages and like, that sounds like a great idea, let's just do that. So we took a bunch of ideas and then tried to adapt it to our style. So we had 5 key phrases, and one of them was act like an owner. So I think culture is something you have, not something you create, not something you enforce. It is what it is. So by acting a certain way, like for Mike and I, the way we acted, the way we drove business, the way we thought about things, it sort of created the atmosphere in which you wanted to work. A great example of that is one time we had a competitor try and learn about our product and basically lied to us that they were this health system, or I forget exactly the scenario, but Mike was very stern about it, and he wrote an email and says, they can act like that, but we'll never act like that. You're never going to lie to a competitor to get in any information on their product. You're going to represent yourself as Clockwise, and you're going to be Clockwise. That's not the behavior we want to condone within our own walls, even though our competitors do it. So that's a great example of taking an opportunity, or in that case, a bad actor, and making it a part of our culture. And so constantly, as we grew and things happened, we would adapt it and make it part of our culture.
Very cool. So now, focused on urgent care, you're now going full time. Tell us what it was like how did you think about ramping up the team? Because one of the challenges we always hear from startups is, well, who do I hire first? What do I do? What's the right order? What's too fast? What's too slow? Talk us through your process of ramping up the team.
Well, I think that it's much more important to hire really, really super talented people than it is to hire for positions. And the other mistake I see a lot of startups making is, particularly with technical founders, is that they have this illusion that they'll build it and then they can just go hire, a hired gun salesperson who's going to go out and get all these sales for them. And I'm a firm believer that the founders themselves have to be, they've got to learn the lessons about what features are required and how to sell a product and that sort of thing. And you can't outsource that. So, I was our first BDR, and we brought on an early sort of another jack of all trades guy named Nick Fraunfelder, who was he put a little bit of money into the business and served as both our CFO and basically our first VP of sales. And we learned the lessons that we needed to learn before we hired anyone. And our motto was always that we absolutely had to feel pain before we were going to go out and hire folks. I'm kind of capital efficient to a fault. I mean,
David's nodding his head yes over there.
Yeah, but I think that we were not interested in venture money, and we did an angel round just because the terms with the angels were not onerous. I mean, there were not the sort of investor preferences that you see in venture deals, and so we brought in what was it, $1 million, $1.5 million, something like that from angels, and we're able to. We were under the illusion every month we said, next month we're going to be cash flow positive, and so we were a month away from cash flow positive for about a year and a half. So it was, but I think that's still a good position to be in, because we always had just enough money to continue to make the decisions we needed to make, and it attracted the attention of some folks that we ultimately did take a small amount of venture money. We ended up taking $2 million, I think, from Martin Ventures, but we were able to do it on our terms, and we were able to be very, very selective about which partner we ended up taking, because we didn't need the money. You're probably all aware that when you don't need money, that's when everyone's going to offer it to you, unfortunately. So we had a very positive experience with Martin. I'm aware of a large number of horror stories, venture capital horror stories. As a matter of fact, one of the sons of one of the founders of my first company is a big VC out or he was a big VC out in Seattle, a guy named Greg Hobson up in Madrona, and now he's running a venture studio. And he was able to show me all the sort of dirty underbelly of the venture industry and all the things that you need to look out for. And to Martin's credit, we were able to avoid all of that, and they were a fantastic partner. And so when a venture company pitches you on the fact that they're going to be value added, that they're going to make introductions for you, and they're going to help you with hires and that sort of thing, if you don't pick the right partner, I think that frequently that never materializes, but for us it actually did, so we had a very positive experience.
One thing I want to add, circle back on pain as an indicator for hiring or growth. I think that was I think when you're in larger companies or you're a smaller company and you just got a big infusion of cash, it's easy to throw people at a problem. For us, we constantly looked for areas to automate, to reduce, to just sort of think through, is there a smarter way to do this versus just throwing people at it? I think if we had a large infusion somewhere along the lines, we probably would have a lot of, layers.
When my other company, when Medscape bought Dialogue Medical, a month after we went to a big trade show, and Medscape spent, I think, $350,000 on this trade show, and it generated 2 leads. And I told them, I warned them in advance that it was probably a show that we would want to go to, but at the time, they were so flush with cash that they were just making decisions that we had a phrase, we had an acronym, OPM, which stood for Other People's Money. And, when you get that sort of venture funding, you make stupid decisions, And if it's your money, or if you feel like it's your money, you make much better decisions.
Oh, great point. So wrap up here, sort of, a couple of minutes, transition on just healthcare in general, but just to close the Clockwise story, tell us decision process to exit, how that came about and why you decided to do that.
Well, we weren't looking to exit. We had at the time a couple of unsolicited offers that we felt we needed to at least look at. And, we were taken out pretty early. But with startups, there are certain local maximums. I mean, if you look at the graph of revenue growth, when you hit, it used to be, I think the numbers are starting to come down now. I think it used to be that one of the first local maximums was right around 10 million in revenue, and I think that it's kind of shifted down. We were less than that when we were sold originally, but I think that in order for us to do much better for an exit, we would have had to have gone heads down for another 3+ years to get to the next local maximum, just to do better than the deal that we received. So it was really the right time to go, and we were in a position too where they really needed us, and so they needed our whole team. Our team members ended up taking several leadership positions in the merged company. Notably, like David is now the CTO of the entire corporation. So we've got other people in leadership positions as well. So it was great for the local team too.
Great. So let's just close a couple just general questions around healthcare and entrepreneurship and how it's different. So one of the challenges I always hear around healthcare for an entrepreneur perspective is all the different stakeholders involved, right? You've got the payers, you've got the providers, you've got the patients, right? All those different types of groups. How do you think about finding who your focus is to sell and serve, as well as connecting that whole ecosystem appropriately?
Well, so there are really sort of 2 different layers that make healthcare a market that is different from all others. One is that it's inherently you have two groups of companies. You have companies that are exploiters who are exploiting the inefficiencies of that market for the benefit of a very small number of people. And then you have solvers who are solving the inefficiencies of the market for the benefit of a very large number of people. And as you can imagine, there's a pretty significant moral hazard as you decide, what sort of company you want to be. And you layer that on top of the disconnect between the champions, the economic buyers, and the derivative end users, which are ultimately comes down to the patients. It's an incredibly complicated matrix of connectivity. Now and I guess there's also a third layer too, insofar as the dynamic to move the patient closer to those economic buying decisions, and that's happening from two different vectors. One, from the fact that patients now have to pay so much more of their healthcare bill, with the high deductibles, et cetera. So they're inevitably moving closer to becoming the economic buyer for some of these decisions. But the other is this notion of value-based care, where we're now, instead of trying to pay hospitals and physicians for doing things, we're trying to move in the direction of paying them for health, which is at least an attempt to move in that direction. And so it's slowly starting to move. And by the way, I can't really take credit for these ideas. Most of them have come from a guy named Chris McCord at Healthcare Growth Partners, who was on our board. So he's much smarter than I am, and he's got this whole market figured out. But to make a long story short, I think that people who are starting healthcare companies need to, first of all, make sure they're on the solver side of that equation, not the exploiter side of the equation, and they have to be on the edge of the envelope in moving towards patient benefit. But unfortunately, they can't be on the bleeding edge. They can't be an idealist, because the current market realities don't support idealists. Unfortunately, there's the inefficiencies and the disconnect between the buyers and the users won't allow a software product, even one that has clear patient benefit. If it doesn't fit the economic model, it's not going to go anywhere, unfortunately.
So last question here, and then we'll open it up for a couple from the audience. Having been through this a couple times, and any key lessons learned you would share with other entrepreneurs who want to get into healthcare that you might have done differently, or watch outs to be ready for?
It's a lot easier, I think, right now than it has been. Like, even when we started, the concept of having a HIPAA compliant application, was pretty new. We got a BAA with AWS. Now they have a web page you can go to that just says HIPAA compliant services, and the list is really long. It used to be very short. You used to have to pay more for all your services. You had to get dedicated instances. So there's a lot on the technology side where things have gotten a lot easier. Most healthcare companies, or at least the ones that we're familiar with, are now web-based. You don't have to think about installing hardware at a site or anything like that. So I would say over the last 4 or 5 years, the first set of questions we get from a healthcare system would be, how's it installed on our servers? And now it's like they first ask, is it web-based? Is it cloud-based? Or is it installed? So it's moved to a point where I believe even doctors and nurses expect something to be web-based and for it to work. The problem you have is making sure it works in the workflow, because they already have to click on 50 things just to bring up a patient. They already have 40 alerts going off. So if you come up with something that doesn't make their workflow easier, the clinic admin's probably not going to incorporate it into their workflow. And if it's not incorporated in workflow, it's not going to be used. And so you've got to figure out how to either incorporate it seamlessly in the workflow, or have it hand off from your product to the next product, or do the integration. And if you've got to do integration, HL7 integration, anything like that, it's just going to take longer. So for most companies, I would recommend the patient route. Like Mike was mentioning, the payers have a choice. And so whether you're offering telemedicine services directly, not related to a hospital, or you're providing that interface for a hospital system so that they can use your software to initiate a telemedicine service, and then it's handed off to the health system after the fact, health system doesn't care. As long as they get CPT codes to bill against and everything else falls in line and they're able to, obtain revenue from the patient, they'll be happy. So it really depends on your idea, what you're trying to do. The closer to the patient you are, it's probably the easier it'll get to convince a health system that it might work, but then you've got to convince a lot of patients to use it. So that's where you have to work with the marketing department at the health system to make sure it's part of their services and it's branded under their umbrella, and you're not trying to take on every health system there is out there who also provides, telemedicine services or things like that. So for me, it's gotten a lot easier, I would say. Back when we started, we were fighting with users who still had, 8-year-old versions of Windows. And now when you tell a hospital system, you got to use Chrome for this, it's going to work a lot better. Oh, I got that. I just never double click it.
So it's a great time to start a healthcare IT business is what you're saying.
Yeah, as long as you're not competing with me.
There we go. Well, cool. We have time for a couple questions from the audience here. Any questions? Blue shirt there in the back.
Hey, so Derek Crane here with Inside Optics today. Providers have this stereotype associated with them that they're kind of technology averse, and especially if they're more experienced, not really willing to adopt new systems or software. How did you get those providers? Well, first of all, do you even agree with that stereotype?
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get some of those providers to help become advocates for your solution rather than detractors?
Well, instead of me giving an uninformed answer, I'm going to ask Byron what he thinks. Byron's an emergency physician, so what do you think?
So, as far as getting providers to adopt any new technology, you're going to run up against the dinosaurs that are always there. There's going to be new guys that know how to do anything. There's some guys that I know they're coders that are still doctors. These guys are not. You're going to run up against a 65-year-old guy who has to double click the mouse with both hands. So I don't know if there's a great way around it other than the fact that those guys are going to retire. They will move on. The newer generation of docs coming out are actually pretty tech savvy. And I'm kind of hearing the feedback thing. So I don't think that you're going to have to do a whole lot of movement to change that. It's going to change on its own.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
Hi, thank you for all your comments. My name is Sommers. I'm with Progress Health. You said you got a lot out of market entrance, right? You didn't need the money, so you got other things like introductions and so on. I don't know if you paid them back by now, if they increased ownership, but now what are you getting out of them? Are they helping you understand our challenges, integration flow? So many different kinds of integration.
Right.
Customers we serve.
Right.
How are they helping you? What else are they doing?
Well, we sold the company in April of 2017, and so they were happy about that. They did well. Interestingly, though, they didn't want to sell, because they came in a little bit later, and so their return, while still being good, was not a 10x return, basically. So if they had their druthers, they would have not sold at a time that we did, but to their credit, they were very supportive of the team, and that was ultimately, the relationship ultimately ended up being very important to them, and they didn't push the issue. So that's sort of where our relationship formally ended, but I continue to stay in contact with them, and they've been a trusted source and advisor. And sorry, is that right? Answer your question?
Integrations are tough.
Hey, my name is Raj. Creating a startup for artificial intelligence. So how is AI in your world, what you're hearing? Obviously that's the biggest, best thing that we're hearing. How will would that be hard to implement from what you hear, or I'm sure there'll be challenges, roadblocks with AI and what's going on in the market. What's your thoughts about AI and how that will impact?
Well, I think that probably a lot of people in this room have already heard the fact that healthcare is years, maybe even decades behind other industries in terms of their technology adoption. And so we're just starting to see healthcare AI-based startups. I mean, meaningfully healthcare AI-based startups. HeartFlow is one of them. I think Sarah's got a list of a few more that he probably has that he knows about. There's Viz.ai, and I don't think that implementation of AI in healthcare is necessarily meaningfully different, except that you have to layer on the regulatory burden and the fact that the regulators don't really know what to do with that. And I've never built an AI company, and so I don't know how well that fits into the traditional 510K PMA regulatory path, for a device. And if you're talking about an administrative, sort of an application, then I would think it wouldn't be largely dissimilar from other industries. I don't know, that's probably a naive view though, since I haven't had to pull it myself.
Yeah, part of it I think is, the doctors are still, or whoever you're selling to, still going to want to see the results. Like, it's got to have an ROI. And the concern with doctors, and doctors would rather clear all their alerts and just look at the one or two things that they really need to focus on for the patient that's right in front of them. The administrators of the hospital want them to see everything because it's a CYA. You got to always cover somebody's ass. And so if you push to the doctor 50 alerts and they miss one, well, it's the doctor's fault. It's not the system's fault. So when it comes to an AI solution, the question is, what decisions am I not making? What did the computer take away from me as a clinical provider? And am I in control of that? Do I understand the impact of that? And if the solution is more for the back office or something like that, they'll want to understand it some more as well. So I think if it's AI for a consumer, it's one of those things. It's like, we reduce the number of messages that flow into your inbox. That's completely different. Like, if I don't get a newsletter that the system automatically filtered out for me, it's not the end of the world. But if I don't get an alert that this patient's, stats don't match, their medication don't match this, and they really need to be seen, and you filtered it out, it's a completely different problem.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I have to say, I know JC's going to be the look to wrap up here, is just remember to, using any buzzword of AI, blockchain, pick your buzzword, the more you can dial what specifically you're using it for, the much better you'll be at, I think, getting people excited around it. So